The old Hensley house had been empty for nearly 20 years before Marissa Green signed the lease. It wasn't the kind of home most people would choose, a two-story Victorian relic with weather-beaten shutters, vines creeping up the porch rails, and a front yard that looked more like a graveyard than a garden. But to Marissa, fresh out of college and desperate to save money, it was perfect. The real estate agent had been strangely eager to rent it out, offering a deal so low it was almost suspicious. Still, the place had electricity, running water, and a working furnace. What could possibly go wrong? Her first few nights were uneventful, though the house had a way of reminding her that it was old. The sighing of wood under its own weight, the flutter of mice in the walls, and the occasional clank of pipes from deep below. But on the fourth night, as she sat unpacking boxes in the living room, she heard it for the first time, a faint, metallic tapping coming from beneath the floorboards. It was rhythmic, tap, pause, tap tap, pause, like someone working with a hammer far underground. She froze, waiting for it to stop. When it finally did, she laughed it off, convincing herself it was just the house settling. The next morning, she decided to explore the basement, partly out of curiosity, partly to find the breaker panel. The door was tucked away behind the kitchen pantry, half hidden under layers of dust. When she pulled it open, the hinges shrieked like something being woken from a deep sleep. A narrow staircase descended into blackness. The air that drifted up smelled damp and sour, tinged with metal and something faintly sweet, like old fruit gone bad. She hesitated, flashlight in hand, her breath fogging in the cold draft rising from below. Each step groaned as she made her way down. The light beam danced across stone walls slick with moisture and shelves lined with forgotten jars. Cobwebs brushed her face, clinging to her hair. The floor was uneven, and puddles rippled as she stepped into them. She spotted the breaker box in the far corner, just beside an old wooden door she hadn't noticed at first, smaller than the others, sealed with a rusted padlock. Her flashlight caught a faint scratch mark on the door, a series of lines carved unevenly into the wood. It looked deliberate, like someone had been counting. She crouched closer, tracing the marks with her finger. There were 7 of them, deep, desperate cuts that stopped abruptly halfway down. The smell was stronger here, that same strange sweetness, as if something had once been trapped behind the door. The tapping sound started again, louder now, from the other side. Tap, tap, tap. Then a pause. Marissa stumbled back, the flashlight flickering. The sound stopped, but she could still hear something faint, a whisper, maybe, or the sound of someone breathing just beyond the wood. When she turned to flee, she thought she saw something, a shadow moving across the far wall that shouldn't have been there at all. Marissa barely slept that night. Every creak of the floorboards above her bed made her heart stutter. The house had gone quiet after she fled the basement, but her mind wouldn't let it rest. She kept hearing the pattern of that tapping, over and over, tap, pause, tap tap, replaying it in her head like a secret message she wasn't meant to understand. When she finally drifted off just before dawn, her dreams were thick with shadows and whispers. She woke up shivering, her bedsheets damp with sweat, her flashlight still clutched in her hand. By the afternoon, sunlight had found its way into the kitchen, warming the air and making her embarrassment bloom. She was a rational person. She didn't believe in ghosts or curses. Maybe it was pipes. Maybe it was an animal trapped behind that basement door. The old house probably had raccoons or possums nesting everywhere. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had heard something alive down there, something that responded to her presence. Curiosity, that dangerous human flaw, began to win over fear. She returned to the basement before sunset, this time carrying her phone and a crowbar she found in the shed. The air was colder again, unnaturally so. It bit at her skin, turning her breath visible in thin white puffs. The puddles on the floor looked frozen around the edges, though the day outside was mild. When she reached the little wooden door, the smell hit her stronger than before, sickly sweet, mixed with the damp rot of something left to decay. Her stomach turned. She leaned closer, listening. There it was, that faint, deliberate scratching. Long drags of something rough against wood, followed by silence. Then again, and again, the padlock trembled slightly, as if from vibrations on the other side. Marissa froze, unable to move, watching tiny flecks of rust fall from the lock with every scrape. She whispered, "Hello?" and immediately regretted it. The scratching stopped. A full, heavy silence filled the air, so thick it made her ears ring. Then, a sound that made her knees go weak, a whisper, low and raspy, forming a single word. Cold. Marissa screamed and stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The beam spun wildly across the walls before landing on something that hadn't been there before, a wet handprint smeared on the inside of the door. Her breath hitched. She grabbed the flashlight, bolted up the stairs, and slammed the basement door behind her. She pressed her back against it, shaking, her pulse pounding in her throat. For a moment, she thought she heard footsteps coming up after her, soft, slow, almost hesitant, but when she threw the bolt shut and listened again, there was only silence. A silence that somehow felt like it was waiting. For 2 days, Marissa refused to go near the basement door. She tried to distract herself with cleaning, unpacking, and blasting music through the house to drown out her thoughts. But silence always found its way back, creeping through the walls, stretching between the notes, reminding her that something was still down there. At night, the house seemed to breathe. She could hear faint groans in the timber, whispery rustles from the vents, and sometimes, something that almost sounded like her name being murmured from far below. She told herself it was her imagination, but she stopped saying that out loud to be why the third night. Exhaustion overcame fear. She had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV still on, the flickering light painting shifting shadows on the ceiling. At first, she thought she was dreaming when she heard it. A soft, deliberate tapping from behind the living room wall. Not from the floor this time. From the wall itself. She turned off the TV, holding her breath. Tap. Pause. Tap tap. The same rhythm as before. Her skin prickled. Slowly, she pressed her ear against the wall. Something moved on the other side. Faint shuffling, followed by a whisper so low it brushed against her mind rather than her ears. Let me in. She stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp. The bulb shattered, throwing the room into darkness. The sound inside the wall grew louder, more frantic, scraping, scratching, like nails dragging through plaster. Her heart pounded as she grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam danced across the walls, revealing cracks that hadn't been there before. Long, jagged lines snaking upward from the floor, like veins spreading through the old paint. The sound stopped again, abruptly. Then, in the silence, something whispered her name. Not from the wall this time, but from the vent above her head. Marissa's pulse thundered in her ears as she stared at the vent grill. Dust quivered around it, disturbed by a faint movement behind the slats. She forced herself closer, trembling, raising the phone's light toward it. The metallic surface reflected just enough to show a pair of eyes staring back, colorless, glinting faintly in the beam, then vanishing with a sudden clang as if something had retreated deeper into the duct. She screamed, dropping her phone. The light blinked out. When she finally scrambled for it again, the vent was empty, just a slow trickle of cold air flowing through. That night, she barricaded the basement door with furniture. She didn't sleep at all. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard faint breathing from the vents, the same rhythm as her own. At 3:17 a.m., the tapping began again, not from the basement, not from the walls, but from inside her bedroom closet. By morning, Marissa's fear had hardened into determination. The exhaustion had burned through her nerves, leaving her shaky but resolute. Whatever was happening in that house, whether it was something rational or not, she couldn't keep pretending it would stop on its own. She made coffee she didn't drink, opened every curtain to chase away the dark corners, and took stock of what she could use: her phone, a hammer, the crowbar from the shed, and a roll of duct tape she found under the sink. It was a ridiculous arsenal, but it gave her the illusion of control. The first step, she decided, was the ventilation system. If something had crawled in there, she needed to see it for herself. The grills were old and loosely fitted, secured with rusted screws. She dragged a chair under the living room vent, the same one where she had seen the eyes, and began unscrewing it, her hands trembling. The metal groaned softly as she pulled it free, releasing a gust of cold, stagnant air that smelled of dust, mildew, and something faintly chemical. She leaned closer, shining her flashlight down the duct. It stretched deep into darkness, lined with years of grime. But there, near the far bend, something glinted. At first, She thought it was a piece of metal. Then she realized it was hair, long strands caught on the inside, dark and matted. Her stomach twisted. She angled the light farther in, and something shifted. A flicker of movement deep in the duct, followed by a slow scraping sound that grew steadily closer. The light caught a hint of pale skin, moving like a serpent through the narrow metal space. She dropped the vent cover and stumbled back, the hammer clattering to the floor. The sound in the duct stopped. Then came a sound she could feel more than hear, a long, drawn-out inhale, as if something on the other side was smelling the air she had disturbed. The rest of the day, she kept hearing it move. Soft thuds from one vent to another, faint metallic vibrations traveling through the walls. It was methodical, almost curious, as though it was following her. When she moved upstairs, the noise followed. When she stood still, so did it. Once, as she passed the hallway mirror, she thought she saw something dart behind her, a flash of movement too fast to focus on. Her reflection lagged for half a second before matching her again. She began taping the vents shut, one by one, sealing them with strips of duct tape until her fingers went numb. The silence afterward was thick and suffocating, but it was better than the sound of movement. That night, the house was unnaturally still. Marissa sat on the edge of her bed, clutching the hammer, listening to the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Her phone buzzed, a notification from her home camera app. She frowned. She hadn't set up any cameras. But the message was clear: motion detected, basement. Her thumb hovered over the screen. When she tapped the video feed, the image was pitch black except for one small flicker of light near the back wall, the wooden door. The padlock was open. And then, for a split second before the feed cut to static, something crawled across the floor toward the stairs. Too long, too fast, and much too thin to be human. The following morning was unusually bright for the season, the sky a pale gold that seemed to soften the chill in the air. Evelyn rose early, unable to shake the innkeeper's words from the night before. Sometimes the past, sometimes the future. She'd lain awake, turning them over. The image of her smiling reflection lodged in her mind like a pebble in her shoe. By the time she came downstairs, the innkeeper was already busy slicing apples for what smelled like a pie. He greeted her with his usual calm warmth, but didn't mention the river, and she didn't ask, not yet. Instead, she walked back to the bend she'd visited the day before. The path was still damp from an early frost, and the grass sparkled faintly in the sunlight. The water at the bend was as still as she remembered, the surface flawless. Evelyn hesitated, then crouched at the edge and reached out her hand until her fingertips brushed the cold surface. She expected ripples to fan out in ordinary rings, but instead, the water seemed to pull inward, the movement converging toward a single point. From that point, an image began to form, blurry at first, then sharpening into something unmistakable. It was the inn's main room, exactly as it had been the night before. The fire, the bookshelves, the kettle hissing on the hearth. But there was something else, someone else. In the vision, a man she didn't recognize was standing at the counter, speaking with the innkeeper in a low voice. The man's coat was long and dark, and though his face was turned slightly away, she caught the sharp line of his jaw, the pale of his skin. She strained to hear, but the image rippled and dissolved before she could catch the words. She sat back on her heels, her heart quickening. The man hadn't been in the inn when she'd arrived in the village. Of that she was certain. Was this the past, the future, or something entirely different? She glanced around, half expecting someone to be watching, but the riverbank was empty save for a few birds pecking at the damp earth. The only sound was the steady movement of the current beyond the bend. When she returned to the inn, the innkeeper looked up from the counter, where he was polishing a row of mismatched cups. His gaze lingered on her a moment longer than usual, as though he knew exactly where she'd been. "You went to the bend," he said, not a question. She opened her mouth to respond, but he added quietly, "When the river shows you someone, it's because your path will cross theirs." Evelyn swallowed, unsure if she felt more curious or uneasy. In her mind, she saw again the man's pale face and dark coat, and wondered just how soon their paths would meet. Marissa didn't remember getting off the floor. One moment, she had been staring at the wet footprints descending the stairs. The next, she was standing in the hallway with every light in the house blazing. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a painful reminder that she was still here, still inside this thing's walls. She should have run then, packed a bag, and left everything behind. But she couldn't, not without knowing what she had let loose. The need to understand had become its own trap. She sat on the living room couch with the hammer on her lap, the clock ticking too loudly on the wall. 2:41 a.m. The house was silent again, that thick kind of quiet that felt alive. She tried to convince herself that exhaustion was playing tricks on her, that the footprints had been condensation or leaking pipes, but every argument collapsed under the weight of what she'd heard whispering by her ear. She told herself she'd wait until dawn, then leave for good. She never made it that FART exactly 3:07 a.m. The sound came back, the slow creak of footsteps overhead. Not hurried, not random, measured, almost curious. They crossed the ceiling toward the staircase, each step deliberate. Marissa stood and raised the flashlight, her throat too dry to call out. The beam flickered, then steadied on the foot of the stairs. Dust drifted lazily in the air, spinning in the pale cone of light. The breathing started again, deep and uneven, echoing down from the landing. And then she saw a shape, a tall, lean silhouette stepping into the light's edge, its proportions subtly wrong, its head bent as if the ceiling were too low. It didn't move toward her at first. It just listened. The wood under its feet groaned softly as it tilted its head, the motion jerky, bird-like. For a long moment, the only sound was the rhythmic rasp of its breath, dry and labored, like someone inhaling through dust. The figure took one step down, and the light caught the side of its face, or what should have been a face. There was skin, pale and smooth, but no features except a single dark hollow where an eye might have been. Marissa gasped, and in that instant, the figure turned toward her fully. The darkness inside its hollow face rippled, and the air around her grew dense and cold, as if the house itself were inhaling. Marissa bolted. She ran through the kitchen, tripping over the edge of a rug, slamming into the counter, fumbling for the back door. The lock jammed. She twisted it once, twice, nothing. Behind her, the floorboards creaked again, closer now. She could feel the air shifting as it moved, hear the faint scrape of its nails against the wall. In pure panic, she ducked into the pantry and pulled the door shut. Darkness swallowed her whole. For a heartbeat, she thought she was safe. Then the whisper came through the slats beside her cheek. "It's been here longer than you." Morning came gray and thin, filtering through the kitchen windows as if reluctant to enter. Marissa had fallen asleep against the pantry door, her neck stiff, her throat raw from breathing too hard. For a few moments, she believed she'd dreamt it all. The footsteps, the whisper, the thing on the stairs. Then she noticed the prints on the tile, faint, elongated impressions that led from the basement door to the pantry, stopping just inches from where she'd hidden. They glistened faintly, as though the air itself still remembered the shape that had made them. She backed away, every muscle in her body screaming to get out, but her phone caught her eye on the counter. The home camera app was open again. Another notification blinked at the top. New recording, 4:02 a.m. With trembling hands, she pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then the frame cleared, showing the living room, still, empty. Slowly, the camera panned by itself, as though guided by unseen fingers. It stopped on the family portrait she'd found when she first moved in, a black and white photo of a couple with a little boy, all standing in front of the same staircase. The boy's face was smudged out, the photograph's surface warped around it. The feed glitched, and in the next instant, the figure from last night was standing inside the frame, between the parents. The recording ended. Something clicked in Marissa's mind. She remembered the realtor's offhand comment. Old Hensley House has been vacant for years. Last tenants didn't stay long. She dug through the drawer where she'd stuffed the lease paperwork and found the original brochure, printed decades ago, judging by the yellowed paper. It mentioned the Hensley family, Jacob and Ruth, and their son, Daniel. They'd built the house in 1911 and vanished in 1936. Locals claimed they'd left town, but the police records had another theory, one unexplained disappearance after another, all starting in the basement. Driven by equal parts dread and obsession, Marissa spent the afternoon combing through old digital archives. The local library's website had a single scanned article from 1937, Bodies Found Beneath Lyndale Home. Investigation ongoing. The photo accompanying it showed the same wooden basement door, surrounded by uniformed men. The text below was half illegible, but a line stood out clearly. The final room was sealed per order of the sheriff. Entry forbidden. Marissa's hands shook as she scrolled further down. A note in the margin of the scan, written in looping pen. We could still hear him calling. The child's voice never stopped. That night, she sat on the living room floor with the old photograph propped against the wall. In the dim light, she traced the blurred outline of the boy's face. The paper was strangely warm to the touch. As she leaned closer, she swore she heard it. A faint, distant tapping from inside the walls, slow and rhythmic. Then, somewhere deep below her feet, a child's voice echoed faintly through the vents. "Mom?" By evening, the air in the house had changed. The faint, musty chill that usually drifted up from the basement was gone, replaced by something stiller, like the pause before thunder. Marissa sat on the bottom stair for a long time, staring at the narrow door that hid the darkness below. The padlock lay on the floor where she had dropped it days earlier, the metal corroded into flakes. She had spent hours reading and rereading the old newspaper article until the words blurred together. If there really had been a child sealed under this house, he had been calling for help for nearly 90 years. The thought pressed against her ribs until she couldn't breathe. She gathered her things carefully: the flashlight, a rope, the crowbar, and her phone. It wasn't bravery that pushed her down those stairs. It was a grim sort of duty, a feeling that the only way out was through. The air grew colder with each step, the smell of damp stone thickening until it coated her tongue. The flashlight beam caught the same shelves of glass jars, each clouded with dust, each reflecting her face in warped miniature. The sealed wooden door waited at the far wall, scarred by the old tally marks she had counted before. 7. She raised the crowbar, heart pounding. The scraping of metal against wood was deafening in the stillness. The latch gave way with a dull snap. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the door drifted open on its own, slow and reluctant, as though the air behind it were pushing outward. A wave of cold poured over her, sharp enough to sting her eyes. She shone the light inside. The space beyond was smaller than she expected: bare stone, a dirt floor, and a single wooden chair half buried in dust. A small shape crouched beside it, knees drawn to chest, the outline unmistakably human. Her voice caught in her throat. "Daniel," she whispered, the name she had read from the newspaper. The figure stirred, turning its head slightly toward her. In the beam, she saw what looked like the faint shimmer of a child's outline, translucent, like breath on glass. The air quivered around him, distorting the walls behind. When he spoke, his voice was soft, high, and very far away. "I waited. They said they'd come back." Marissa's tears stung as she stepped closer. "I can help you," she said. "I'll get you out." The boy shook his head. "You can't. He's still here." Before she could ask what he meant, the temperature dropped again, and a sound rose from behind her: the slow, deliberate creak of footsteps on the basement stairs. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they began, leaving only silence that pressed against our ears. My cousin clutched my sleeve, whispering for us to leave, but something in me resisted. It wasn't bravery. It was the unnerving sensation that if we left now, we'd never stop wondering what had been up there. So, we moved together, tiptoeing through the stale air toward a narrow staircase on the left side of the room. Each step groaned like a warning, as though the house disapproved of our ascent. Point 2 that the second floor was darker, the boarded windows filtering in only fractured streaks of daylight. Wallpaper hung in peeling strips, patterned with faded roses that looked more like splatters of dried blood. We stood still, listening, trying to catch another sound. The silence had weight, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Then, from the far end of the hall, a door creaked open by itself. The sliver of shadow it revealed seemed darker than the rest of the house, as though it led somewhere deeper than just another room. Point 3. We inched closer, hearts pounding. Inside the room, the air smelled metallic, sharp, like rust or blood. Against the far wall stood a tall mirror, its ornate wooden frame dulled with time. The glass itself was fogged, but clear enough to show our reflections. At least, I thought it showed us. I frowned, realizing something was off. While I stood still, the version of me in the mirror tilted its head ever so slightly, like a predator studying prey. My cousin gasped, tugging at my arm. "Don't look," he muttered, but I couldn't turn away. The longer I stared, the more wrong the reflection became. My mirrored eyes were sunken, hollow, and something black and writhing pulsed in the shadows beneath them. Worse, the figure beside me, the reflection of my cousin, wasn't beside me at all in the real room. I glanced quickly, terrified, only to find him standing several feet back near the door. Yet in the mirror, his twin leaned right against my shoulder, grinning with teeth too sharp, too numerous. My throat tightened, and a prickling ran up the back of my neck, as if something unseen had drawn closer behind meth glass rippled. Just faintly at first, like water disturbed by a fingertip. Then, the mirrored version of me began to raise its hand, slow and deliberate, until its palm pressed against the inside of the glass. I staggered back, bumping into my cousin, who was now shaking his head violently. "We're leaving. Now." He didn't wait for me to agree. He yanked me toward the door. As we stumbled into the hall, I dared one last glance over my shoulder. The mirror no longer showed me at all. It showed only the room, empty, except for a dark silhouette that stood where I had been. Dawn came softly, spilling thin light through the narrow basement windows. Marissa was still sitting on the steps, her flashlight long dead in her hand. The air no longer bit at her skin. It was still cold, but it felt different now, cleansed somehow, as though the house had exhaled after holding its breath for too many years. The wooden door to the small room hung open, motionless. The faint shimmer that had marked the child's outline was gone. Only the smell of old stone and dust remained, the normal scent of an old house waking up again. She stood slowly, muscles aching. Every sound was ordinary now, the groan of wood, the sigh of pipes. Yet she knew the difference. The basement no longer listened. She stepped into the little room once more and looked around. A faint pattern had appeared in the dust on the floor, small footprints leading toward the open door, fading halfway across the threshold. Marissa crouched, brushing her hand across them. The dust swirled and settled. Somewhere high above, a bird called. A bright, simple sound that made her realize how long she had lived without hearing one inside these walls. Upstairs, the light seemed almost too bright. She opened the front door and let in the cold air, breathing it in like medicine. The house felt empty, but not abandoned, like a place that had finally remembered how to be quiet. She gathered her things without hurry. The hammer, the rope, the phone. Before leaving, she stood in the living room and looked once more at the old photograph she had propped against the wall. The family inside was clear now. The father, the mother, and the boy, all looking straight at the camera, no blurs, no missing faces. For the first time, it looked like a home. When she stepped outside, the morning was washed in pale gold. She locked the door behind her, though she knew it didn't matter anymore. The silence that followed wasn't menacing. It was peaceful. On the porch rail, a spider web shimmered with dew, untouched and perfect. She glanced back once at the windows, half expecting to see a movement, a shadow. But there was nothing, just sunlight on old glass and the slow drift of dust in the air. Whatever had lingered there was gone. As she reached the gate at the end of the path, a faint wind rose, brushing through the trees. For a heartbeat, she thought she heard a voice, small, bright, childlike, say, "Thank you." The sound was carried away almost at once, lost in the morning. Marissa smiled, something she hadn't done in days, and walked on without looking back. Behind her, the Hensley house stood quietly under the thin October light, its doors closed, its secrets finally asleep.